The Bastion Fort, also known as Star Forts, magnificent work of art of military design, beautiful in every way, and built to withstand the test of time, literally. It's on record that most of these bastion fortresses were built between the 15th and 16th century. Well,
that was a lie.
These forts are older than that, much, much older. Some are so old that the earth is swallowing them up. And I'm willing to bet that there's one underwater which would be kept hidden from us because it would make us question the others. After this video, you will question the others. Get ready, you're about to go on a ride. Castello de San Marcos, or St. Mark's Castle, is the oldest masonry fort in the continental United States, located in St. Augustine, Florida, claimed to be built 1672 to 1695 by the Spaniards and maybe some slaves. Apparently all the forts in the US discovered in the 1700s were supposedly built by the British, and still unverified that they used slave labor or not, which we know they didn't because the forts were already here. All the others after, apparently still following this plan of fort building, have built dozens more during the 1800s by slave labor. Let's break down the problem with this theory. First of all, it was very expensive to produce a bastion fort. One of the first imperatives for the new U.S. government after the War of 1812 was to build star forts, as Washington, D.C. had been put to the torch by the British and no one was interested in allowing that to happen again. You didn't really think the military owned slaves, did you? They may have used prisoners, but that wasn't enough. They leased slaves, pretty much like they do with prisoners today. But this was a huge problem because slave owners refused to give up their slaves. Even though the government would compensate them, it was nothing compared to what they would make keeping their slaves in the fields. Also, it took an average of 30 years to complete one of these forts according to his story. So who in their right mind giving up their slaves for 30 years? So they refused. And that was the problems with just one fortification in the Battle of Galveston in 1862. Fortification, a defensive wall or other reinforcement built to strengthen a place against attack. It's not even a full defensive fort. This was the problem they had. They urgently needed slaves to build defenses due to the troops that are active in the Civil War. The military asked local plantation and slave owners to volunteer some of their slaves. We already know their response. It got to the point where the government was going to take the slaves by force, and is the only one on record as to needing slaves to help build it. Imagine going through that with the few forts they claimed were being built simultaneously. But that's not the only trouble they had with using slaves. It was the constant worry the few slaves that were volunteered of escaping to the enemy with information. And let's not forget the bastion forts being built overseas around that same time. That's a strange coincidence. Whoever the designer was must have made a killing selling the same blueprint to everyone. Cracked an eye yet? Still sleep? Let's use common sense. You know that thing they train us not to use? How easy do you think it was to get slaves with limited time and resource to continue to build forts during the Civil War and conveniently completed over 60 forts around the time of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation? They can't have on record forts were still being built after the slaves were freed. Oh no. By 1821, there were 12 free states, some of them having star forts, like Fort Crown Point in New York that was constructed and occupied by the British. Though there's little evidence that the British owned any slaves, how did they manage to construct a fort with limited resource? Even though the British, as far as I know, didn't use slave labor, they were heavily involved in the transatlantic slave trade. Don't get it twisted. Do you really think Indians or free slaves will help build forts in the free states that were designed against them? Let that simmer. Up until the Emancipation Proclamation, up to 90% of all U.S. wars since the birth of the United States was with Indian tribes. Most forts were built by the waters. They wasn't worried about no ships, especially since they had their own ships patrolling the oceans. Were these forts built for the Indians? Hard to comprehend since Indians are not known to possess any cannons. It doesn't add up. Still sounds like slaves built those forts? Man, all of history is a lie. And finally, there are no images, drawings, or photograph of any bastion forts anywhere under construction. But look, here's images of the Capitol building under construction in 1858. Wasn't there a couple of forts under construction during that same time period? Wasn't there more cameras back then? But wait, there's more. The Statue of Liberty is on a fort. Did you know that? We also have tons of images of the Statue of Liberty under construction, but not one image of one stone being laid for the fort that is on top of. Sometimes they make exposing them too easy. I believe there was a time where every continent on the planet was on the same page and had these similar design forts and focused them on the same common threat. I can't see the East and West being enemies and having the same design defenses. They would know each other's weak points. It doesn't make sense. Did this common enemy come from the air? I doubt it. The fort would be useless for air attacks. I can only think of two things. Either it was intended for something in the waters or giants. It does appear that it was intended for something in the waters. Look at the concentration of forts on the coastlines. They didn't seem too concerned about the Pacific. If it was intended for something in the waters, it appears the highest concentration of activity would be in this area right here. What could they possibly be shooting at? Could it have been something organic and huge that lives in the water like a giant sea creature that walks the land? Underwater aliens? Well, once again, I'm watching random videos to pass the time, and one video containing about a 15-second segment talks about the city of Atlantis and pointed out its believed location. Recognize the signs, people. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know much about the city of Atlantis story. It never interests me. It interests me now because when coincidence shows up like that, for me, a lot of times I'm right. Could these forts confirm the myth of Atlantis as being true? It seems to fit. Atlantis, if it was a bad and corrupt superpower as it was written, and them having a superior naval fleet that dominated the seas, then the excessive forts on both coastlines may have been necessary and verify the true age and purpose of these forts. What technology they possessed back then? How did it get lost? Even though no evidence of the city had been found, and I believe that's because eager explorers are under the impression that the city dropped straight down. I remember when I used to eat at McDonald's and they would have a donation box on the counter for the Ronald McDonald House. One place was clever and had a fish tank full of water with a shot glass in the middle. The trick was you drop a coin in the water, and if the coin makes it in the shot glass, you get a free cheeseburger. Needless to say, they collected a lot of coins, and maybe 2 was in the shot glass. That's what happened to the city. It acted like the coin flipping all over the place. That's why they can't find the city. It's not straight down and possibly upside down. Only chance will find the remains of the city. After the city sunk in the ocean, there were no more need for the forts and they were decommissioned and abandoned, which is why the dates of their constructions for them are all over the place. His story is a lie. As I mentioned in the previous video that there are hundreds of these forts. Well, originally it was more than that. You look at old drawings of these forts and some of them doesn't even exist anymore. There's no telling if it was drawn off imagination or it was completely destroyed. One thing still remains though, not one image of any fort under construction. If you find one, I really would like to see it. I'll even give you a shout out. Tracking down the matches to some of these drawings was a little more difficult than I thought. Just for shits and giggles, I decided to see if there was a fort that matches the one in this drawing. And there is one that very closely resembles the one in this drawing. It's our old friend St. Mark's Castle, or Castello de San Marcos. Now we can understand why Fort Castello de San Marcos would be the oldest fort in the United States, because it was the first one of America that was documented. This is what happened. Remember when I said in part 1 that the Atlantic slave trade follows a clockwise direction? When the Spaniards made landfall in America, Fort Marion, or whatever it was called back then, may have been the first fort they seen. And since it was abandoned, the Spaniards claimed it as a port and renamed it in honor of Spain. Those are the Spaniards' cannons. Forts turned to ports, eventually slave ports. Here's where the lies and the notoriety of coincidence comes in. Mr. Ogilvy's book of Ogilvy's America was published in 1671. Construction began in 1672. Did Mr. Ogilvy see the future? Or are we being fed lies to fit the invaders into the alternate version of history we've been taught? And the only reason it would be hard to accept this new version of history is because the spell you're under is real. Common sense is your natural born defense against bullshit. Use it. I was under the spell too. Hard. until I saw that one video about Jesus never existed. I started thinking and that was it. I snapped out of it and started questioning everything. The first step to waking up is to put your fears aside. Fear is the second strongest spell, love being the first because love always overcomes fear. So, how do you feel about the star forts now? Do you feel that they are older than what they are telling us? Do you think it was still built by slaves? Do you think it validates the city of Atlantis? Or did I just get lucky and piece unrelated stories together that conveniently seems to fit? I want to know. Before I go, I'd like to wish for everyone to stay safe, stay strong, because Bizarro World is about to get more bizarre. If airline pilots reporting passing men with jetpacks don't sound strange to you, don't worry, it's just the beginning. And as always, thank you for watching and thank you for sharing your time with me.